The champagne tower collapsed in slow motion, crystal glasses shattering across the marble floor of Timberline Lodge as 200 wedding guests gasped in horror. But that wasn't what made the bride scream. It was the projection on the wall behind the ruined display, cycling through documents that told a story neither Marcus Hamilton nor Vanessa Price wanted anyone to see. As security rushed toward the equipment, I watched from my car in the parking lot, tablet in hand, knowing that the gift box I'd sent 3 days earlier had just detonated exactly as planned. The card had read simply "Congratulations on building your future together," but what they didn't know was that I'd spent 6 months ensuring that future would crumble before it even began. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The end of my relationship with Marcus didn't announce itself with fireworks or dramatic pronouncements. It arrived on a Wednesday evening in March, wrapped in the mundane details of ordinary life. I had stopped by our Pearl District loft unexpectedly, arms full of Thai takeout from the place on Burnside we'd been going to for 3 years, the one where they knew our order by heart. Marcus was supposed to be in Seattle for a client pitch. His car wasn't supposed to be in the garage. Vanessa Price's designer handbag wasn't supposed to be on our kitchen counter. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching 2 people I thought I knew become strangers in an instant. Marcus didn't scramble for explanations or apologies. He simply pulled on his shirt with the casual ease of someone who'd been caught doing something mildly inconvenient rather than devastating. Vanessa sat up against the headboard we'd picked out together at that vintage shop in Selwood, pulling the sheets around herself with a practiced grace that suggested this wasn't her first time in my bed. "How long?" I asked. My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Marcus glanced at Vanessa before answering, and that small gesture of silent communication told me everything I needed to know. They had their own language already, their own understanding that excluded me completely. 8 months, he said finally. We met at the Summit Digital Conference in San Francisco. It just happened, Lauren. These things just happen. I set the Thai food on the dresser, the plastic containers suddenly absurd in their cheerful red and white packaging. The smell of basil and coconut curry filled the room, mixing with Vanessa's perfume and the unmistakable scent of betrayal. Nothing just happens for 8 months, I said quietly. 8 months is a choice you make every single day. Vanessa spoke for the first time, her voice carrying that particular blend of confidence and false sympathy that would become sickeningly familiar. Marcus and I didn't mean for this to hurt you. We tried to fight it, but sometimes you meet someone and you just know they're meant to be in your life. The audacity of her sitting in my bed, wearing what appeared to be my robe, explaining to me about destiny and meant to be, should have made me angry. Instead, I felt something colder settle into my chest, a clarity that cut through the shock like winter air. I looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw a man I'd been building a future with for 4 years reveal himself as someone I'd never actually known at all. I left that night with 2 suitcases and my laptop, leaving behind the furniture we'd bought together, the artwork we'd collected, the kitchen gadgets we'd received as housewarming gifts when we'd signed the lease with such optimism. My best friend Kara picked me up without asking questions, just loading my bags into her Subaru and driving me to her place in the Hawthorne district while I sat in silence, watching the city lights blur past the window. The following weeks moved with a strange dreamlike quality. Marcus handled the logistics of our separation with the same efficiency he brought to his marketing campaigns. He hired movers to pack my remaining belongings, transferred his half of our joint savings account, and CC'd me on emails to our landlord about breaking the lease. Everything was cordial, professional, wrapped in the language of mutual respect and amicable parting. His friends reached out with carefully worded messages about how sorry they were things didn't work out, as if our 4-year relationship had simply expired like a subscription service neither of us wanted to renew. What nobody mentioned, what everyone carefully avoided, was Vanessa. She had vanished from social media, her Instagram account suddenly private, her LinkedIn profile scrubbed of any photos from company events. It was only when I ran into Brandon Cole at a coffee shop in early April that I started to understand the scope of what had actually happened. Brandon had been Marcus's college roommate and closest friend, the kind of guy who showed up to help you move and never asked for anything in return. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me at Stumptown, like he wanted to pretend he hadn't noticed me standing in line. But I caught his eye and something in his expression made me abandon my coffee order and follow him outside. We stood on the sidewalk in the spring drizzle, neither of us quite willing to be the first to speak. Finally, Brandon shoved his hands in his pockets and said the thing everyone else had been too polite to acknowledge. "I'm sorry about Marcus and Vanessa. For what it's worth, I think he's making a massive mistake." The validation felt good even as it changed nothing. "I appreciate that," I told him. "How long have you known?" His grimace told me the answer before he spoke. "I suspected something last summer at the company retreat in Bend. Marcus kept disappearing during the evening sessions, and Vanessa always seemed to be missing at the same time. But I didn't know for sure until December when Marcus asked me if I thought you'd be okay if he started seeing someone from work, hypothetically speaking, of course." December. 4 months before I'd walked in on them. 4 months while Marcus was still kissing me goodbye every morning, still making plans for our summer vacation to the coast, still letting me believe we were building something permanent. The timeline rewrote itself in my mind, every moment from the past year suddenly suspect and unreliable. Brandon must have seen something in my face because he continued talking, words tumbling out like he'd been holding them back for months. "Look, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Marcus and Vanessa are getting serious. Like, moving in together serious. He asked me to be his best man last week." The information hit me like cold water. It had been less than a month since I'd moved out, barely enough time for the forwarded mail to stop arriving at the Pearl District loft. "They're engaged," I said flatly, not quite a question. "Not yet," Brandon said carefully. "But Marcus has been looking at rings. He showed me this enormous diamond at a jeweler downtown, said he was planning to propose at some resort in June. Timberline Lodge, I think. Vanessa apparently loves that place." Something shifted in me standing there on that rain-slicked sidewalk, watching people hurry past with their umbrellas and their uncomplicated lives. The shock and grief that had numbed me for weeks began to crystallize into something sharper. Marcus wasn't just moving on. He was accelerating into a whole new life with the woman he'd been secretly seeing while I planned our grocery lists and coordinated our social calendar and believed in the reality of us. "Thank you for telling me," I said to Brandon. "I mean it." He looked relieved to have the conversation ending. "For what it's worth, Lauren, you deserve so much better than what he did to you. Marcus used to be a good guy, but success changed him. Summit Digital took off and suddenly he started acting like he was entitled to whatever he wanted." I drove back to Kara's apartment in a daze, Brandon's words echoing in my mind. Summit Digital had indeed taken off in the past year, Marcus's marketing firm landing several major clients and expanding from a team of 5 to over 20 employees. The company had been Marcus's dream since business school, something he'd built from nothing through sheer determination and 18-hour workdays. I'd supported that dream, taking on extra freelance work when money was tight in the early days, understanding when dates got cancelled because of client emergencies, celebrating every milestone like it was our shared victory. But somewhere in that success, Marcus had started believing his own mythology. The hard-working entrepreneur became the visionary CEO. The guy who used to cook dinner in our tiny kitchen transformed into someone who networked at exclusive restaurants and took meetings on golf courses. And apparently, the man who'd told me I was his person had decided he deserved an upgrade to match his new tax bracket. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on Kara's futon scrolling through my phone, looking at the digital breadcrumbs of my relationship with Marcus. Photos from hiking trips in the gorge, New Year's Eve parties with friends, lazy Sunday mornings at the farmer's market. In every image, I looked happy. Genuinely, completely happy. The Lauren in those photos had no idea she was being lied to, that the man with his arm around her shoulders was building an exit strategy with someone else. I created a new folder on my laptop and started downloading everything. Photos, emails, text messages, receipts from shared expenses. I wasn't sure why I was doing it, what purpose this digital archaeology would serve. But some instinct told me to preserve the evidence of what we'd been, or what I'd thought we'd been, before it could be revised or forgotten. In the process, I discovered something odd. Our joint credit card statement from January showed a charge for $3,000 at a jewelry store in downtown Portland. I'd never seen that charge before because Marcus had always handled our credit card payments, transferring my half to his account each month. $3,000 in January, 2 months before we'd broken up, 5 months into his relationship with Vanessa. I pulled up our bank statements next, going back through the past year with new eyes. A pattern emerged that I'd been too trusting to notice before. Regular transfers from our joint account to Marcus's business account, always with vague descriptions like client entertainment or business development. Over 12 months, more than $40,000 had moved from the money we'd saved together into Summit Digital's accounts. We'd been saving for a down payment on a house, cutting back on dinners out and weekend trips to build our nest egg. Or at least, I had been saving. Marcus had been funding something else entirely, using our combined resources to finance his company while I lived frugally and proud of our shared sacrifice. The next morning, I called Rachel Donnelly, a law school friend who'd gone into corporate litigation. We met at the Heathman Hotel over coffee, and I spread out my laptop and printed bank statements across the table between us. Rachel's expression grew darker as she reviewed the financial records, her lawyer instincts clearly activated by what she was seeing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "This is not good," she said finally. "These transfers from your joint account need documentation. Did you authorize any of this business spending?" I shook my head. Marcus always said he was handling the finances because he had the business background. I trusted him. Rachel's laugh was bitter. "Of course you did. You were in a relationship. But legally, he needed your explicit consent to move money from a joint account into his business. And if he was using your contributions for personal expenses like jewelry for another woman, that's potentially fraud." The word hung in the air between us. Fraud. Such a clinical term for what felt like a deeply personal violation. "Can I do anything about it?" I asked. Rachel tapped her pen against her notepad, thinking. "Depends on how far you want to take this. You could file a civil suit for the misappropriated funds, but that's expensive and time-consuming and might not be worth it for $40,000 after legal fees. But if you want to really dig into this, I have a friend who does forensic accounting. If Marcus was mixing personal and business funds, using investor money inappropriately, or engaging in any other financial irregularities, that becomes a much bigger problem." I thought about Marcus and Vanessa planning their fairy tale wedding at Timberline Lodge, probably using money that should have been mine to fund their celebration. I thought about 4 years of my life built on someone else's lies, about the version of myself who'd believed in partnership and shared dreams. And I thought about how Marcus had walked away from our relationship without consequences, moving seamlessly into his new life while I rebuilt mine from nothing. "Let's dig," I said. Rachel made the call right there, and by that afternoon I had an appointment with Kevin Torres, a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes. His office was in a nondescript building near Powell's Books, the kind of place you could walk past 100 times without noticing. Kevin himself was nothing like the detectives from movies, just a middle-aged guy with reading glasses and a mind that worked like a calculator. He listened to my story without interrupting, taking occasional notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he asked to see all the financial records I'd brought. For the next hour, he went through everything with meticulous attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting I forward him additional documentation. "Here's what I can tell you already," Kevin said finally. "Your ex-boyfriend's company has grown very quickly, which always raises questions about funding sources and financial practices. The transfers from your joint account are concerning but probably legal if he can argue you had implied consent through your domestic partnership. However, he tapped a specific line on a bank statement. These amounts and timing are interesting." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Summit Digital received a significant venture capital investment last August," Kevin explained. "That's a matter of public record because they did a press release about it. But look at these transfers from your joint account. They spike dramatically in the 3 months leading up to that investment, then drop off afterward. That suggests Marcus might have been using your money to inflate his company's financial position before the due diligence process." "Is that illegal?" I asked. "Potentially," Kevin said. If he misrepresented his company's financial health to investors by using personal funds to create false metrics, that's fraud. And if any of those investors were institutional or if there were any federal regulations involved, it could be securities fraud, which gets the FBI interested. The scope of what Kevin was suggesting made my head spin. I'd come here thinking about recovering some money Marcus had taken from our savings. Now I was hearing terms like securities fraud and FBI. This is bigger than I thought, I said quietly. Kevin nodded. It usually is. Men who cheat in their personal lives often have problems with boundaries in other areas too. The same entitlement that lets someone deceive their partner for 8 months tends to show up in how they do business. Give me 2 weeks and access to what you've provided, and I'll tell you if there's a real case here or if your ex is just a garden variety jerk who's bad with money. I authorized Kevin to proceed with his investigation, signing forms and writing a check for his retainer that made my freelance writer's budget wince. Walking out of his office into the gray Portland afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that night at Stumptown with Brandon. Not hope exactly, but purpose. Marcus had moved on as if our 4 years together had been nothing more than a chapter in his success story, something to be edited out of his personal narrative. But every story has consequences, and I was about to make sure his actually arrived. Over the next 2 weeks, I tried to return to some version of normal life. I took on new freelance projects, helped Kara plant her vegetable garden, went to yoga classes where I failed to achieve inner peace but at least got some exercise. But underneath the routine activities, I was constantly checking my phone for updates from Kevin, wondering what he was uncovering in Summit Digital's financial records. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner in Kara's tiny kitchen. Kevin's voice was carefully neutral in that way that meant he'd found something significant. "Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" he asked. "I have information you need to see in person." I barely slept that night, my mind racing through possibilities. The next morning, I arrived at Kevin's office to find him surrounded by spreadsheets and documents, his desk covered in the archaeology of Marcus's business dealings. He gestured for me to sit and slid a folder across the desk toward me. "Your instincts were correct," Kevin said. "Marcus Hamilton has been running Summit Digital like his personal piggy bank. The venture capital funding he received last August was based on financial projections and metrics that were significantly inflated. He used funds from your joint account, along with money from several other personal sources, to create the appearance of stronger cash flow and customer acquisition than the company actually had." "How much are we talking about?" I asked, opening the folder to see page after page of highlighted transactions. "Between your money and other sources, probably close to $200,000 used to manufacture fake financial health. But here's where it gets interesting." Kevin pulled out another document. "Vanessa Price is listed as Summit Digital's Director of Client Relations. She's been on the payroll since last July, right around when their relationship started. Her salary is substantially higher than industry standard for someone with her experience, and I can't find evidence that she actually does much work for the company." "So he's paying his mistress with investor money," I said slowly. "Essentially, yes. And there's more." Kevin showed me bank records for an LLC called Cascade Holdings. Marcus and Vanessa formed this company together in December. It owns the condo they're living in now in Lake Oswego. The down payment came from a Summit Digital business account, classified as a real estate investment for future office expansion. "They bought their love nest with company funds," I said, the absurdity of it almost making me laugh. "Gets better," Kevin continued. "The wedding they're planning at Timberline Lodge in June. The deposit came from the same business account. $15,000 charged to Summit Digital's corporate card, categorized as a company retreat expense." I sat back in my chair, trying to process the scope of what Kevin had uncovered. Marcus hadn't just cheated on me and moved on. He'd built an entire fraudulent structure to fund his new life with Vanessa, using money from investors who thought they were backing a legitimate growing company. The wedding they were planning, the life they were celebrating, was constructed on a foundation of lies and stolen money. "What can I do with this information?" I asked Kevin. "Several things," he said. "First, you have grounds for a civil suit to recover your $40,000. But more significantly, this is the kind of fraud that regulatory agencies care about. The venture capital firms who invested in Summit Digital would want to know their money is being misused. The SEC would be interested in the fraudulent metrics used to secure funding. And if you want to go nuclear, the FBI's white-collar crime division loves cases like this. I thought about Marcus standing in our bedroom telling me that 8 months of deception had just happened, like he'd had no agency in his choices. I thought about Vanessa explaining that some people were meant to be together, as if destiny justified destroying someone else's life. And I thought about the wedding invitation that had arrived at Kara's apartment just that morning, forwarded from my old address, inviting me to celebrate Marcus Hamilton and Vanessa Price as they begin their journey together. I left Kevin's office with copies of everything he'd uncovered, the documents feeling heavy in my messenger bag as I walked through downtown Portland. The spring afternoon was bright and clear, cherry blossoms drifting down from the trees along the park blocks, people sitting outside cafes enjoying the sunshine. Everything looked normal and beautiful, but I was carrying evidence of a fraud that would destroy the life Marcus had built with Vanessa. The question wasn't whether I had the ammunition. It was how and when I chose to use it. Rachel met me for dinner that evening at a quiet restaurant in the Alberta Arts District. I spread Kevin's findings across the table between our plates of pasta, watching her lawyer's mind work through the implications of each document. She took her time, occasionally making notes, asking me to clarify specific transactions or timelines. When she finally set down the last page, her expression was a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "This is damaging," she said carefully. "Very damaging. Marcus and Vanessa have exposed themselves to serious legal consequences. The question is what outcome you actually want here, Lauren. Do you want your money back? Do you want them prosecuted? Do you want to blow up their wedding? Because the path you choose determines the strategy we employ." I realized I hadn't thought beyond the discovery itself. For weeks, I'd been focused on finding out the truth, on understanding what had actually happened during those 8 months when Marcus was living a double life. But now that I had answers, now that I understood the full scope of his betrayal, I needed to decide what justice actually looked like. "I want them to face consequences," I said slowly. "Real consequences, not just an apology and a check." Marcus destroyed our relationship without a second thought, used money I earned to fund his affair and his business fraud, and now he's planning this elaborate wedding like he's some kind of romantic hero instead of a criminal. I want that illusion shattered the same way mine was. Rachel nodded, her expression understanding but cautious. "Then we need to be strategic about timing. If you go to the authorities now, the investigation could take months or even years. Marcus might settle quietly, restructure his business, and move on with minimal public embarrassment. But if you wait until he's more exposed, more vulnerable, the impact will be exponentially greater." "The wedding," I said, the pieces clicking into place. "You think I should wait until the wedding?" "I think you should consider it," Rachel replied. "Marcus is spending investor money on a destination wedding at a luxury resort. He's inviting business partners, investors, clients, everyone who matters to Summit Digital's success. If his fraud became public in that setting, in front of everyone he's trying to impress, the fallout would be immediate and irreversible. His business reputation would be destroyed along with his personal one." The idea was both appealing and terrifying. Part of me wanted to act immediately, to report everything to the authorities and let the legal system grind Marcus through its mechanisms. But another part recognized the poetic justice in what Rachel was suggesting. Marcus had used our relationship as a stepping stone to his success, discarding me when someone more aligned with his elevated status came along. Exposing him at the pinnacle of his triumph, surrounded by the people whose approval he craved, felt appropriately symmetrical. "How would it even work?" I asked. "I can't just show up at his wedding with a presentation about financial fraud." Rachel smiled, and I recognized the expression from our law school days when she'd found the perfect angle for an argument. "You don't have to show up at all. You send the information to the right people at the right time, and let the consequences unfold naturally." The venture capital firms who invested in Summit Digital, the business partners who trusted him, even some key wedding guests who have a right to know what they're celebrating. The information speaks for itself. Over the next few days, I wrestled with the decision. The ethical implications kept me awake at night. Was I becoming the kind of person who planned elaborate revenge instead of taking the high road? Was destroying Marcus's wedding and possibly his freedom proportional to what he'd done to me? But then I'd remember the casual cruelty of his voice when he'd said these things just happen, or I'd see another social media post from their friends congratulating them on their beautiful love story, and my resolve would harden. I also had to consider Vanessa's role in all this. She wasn't just a passive participant in Marcus's fraud. According to Kevin's investigation, she was actively benefiting from it, drawing an inflated salary for minimal work and helping Marcus hide assets in their jointly owned LLC. She'd known Marcus was in a relationship when their affair started, had sat in my bed wearing my robe explaining about destiny, and was now planning a wedding funded by stolen investor money. Whatever happened, she'd earned her share of the consequences. The decision crystallized one afternoon in early May when I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message contained a link to Vanessa's Instagram, which had recently gone public again. I clicked through to find an elaborate wedding countdown, complete with engagement photos at Multnomah Falls, posts about dress fittings and cake tastings, and gushing captions about finding your soulmate and building a life with your best friend. One photo in particular made my blood run cold. It showed Marcus and Vanessa in what was clearly our old Pearl District loft, the one we'd shared for 3 years. The caption read, "So grateful to be building our home in the space where Marcus first knew he wanted something more." The comments were full of heart emojis and congratulations, people praising their courage for following their hearts. Marcus hadn't just moved on from our relationship. He'd erased it completely, rewriting our shared history into the origin story of his romance with Vanessa. The loft where we'd hosted dinner parties and celebrated anniversaries and planned our future had become the setting for his revelation that I wasn't enough. And now hundreds of people were liking and commenting on this revised narrative, validating his version of events where he was the romantic lead instead of the villain. I called Rachel immediately. "I've made my decision," I told her. "I want to move forward with everything. The venture capital firms, the regulatory agencies, all of it. And I want it to happen at the wedding." Rachel's voice was calm and professional. "I'll need a few weeks to prepare everything properly. We'll need to coordinate timing with multiple parties, make sure the evidence is airtight, and ensure you're protected legally. Can you commit to seeing this through once we start? Because once we pull this trigger, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure," I said, and I was. Marcus and Vanessa had made their choices over and over for 8 months, every lie and deception a deliberate act. Now they'd face the natural consequences of those choices, served up on what was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. Rachel put together a team that included Kevin Torres, a contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission named Agent Christopher Barnes, and a forensic accountant named Dr. Helen Morrison who specialized in startup fraud. Over the following weeks, they built an irrefutable case documenting every instance of financial misconduct at Summit Digital. The misuse of investor funds, the inflated metrics, the payments to Vanessa for non-existent work, the personal expenses charged to business accounts, all of it meticulously documented and cross-referenced. My role was to provide the personal financial records showing how Marcus had used our joint savings to create the illusion of business success. I also worked with Kevin to establish a timeline proving Marcus and Vanessa had formed their LLC and begun planning their real estate investments while he was still in a committed relationship with me, using money I'd contributed in good faith toward our shared future. Dr. Morrison was particularly interested in the jewelry store charge from January. She traced that $3,000 purchase to an engagement ring Marcus had bought 2 months before our relationship officially ended. The ring now on Vanessa's finger in all those Instagram photos had been purchased with funds from our joint account, meaning I'd essentially paid for the symbol of their upcoming marriage. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. But it also provided concrete evidence of Marcus's pattern of deception and financial impropriety. He'd used shared resources to pursue a relationship with another woman while maintaining the facade of commitment to me. If he'd do that in his personal life, Dr. Morrison argued in her report, it established his character and made his business fraud more credible to investigators. Agent Barnes from the SEC was cautious at first, requiring extensive documentation before committing to an investigation. But once he saw the full scope of Summit Digital's financial irregularities, his interest intensified. White-collar crimes involving venture capital fraud were taken seriously, especially when they showed a pattern of deliberate deception rather than simple mismanagement. The case Rachel's team had built gave him everything he needed to launch a formal inquiry. The plan came together with precision timing. Agent Barnes would arrive at Timberline Lodge on the day of the wedding with a warrant to seize Summit Digital's financial records and question Marcus about specific transactions. The venture capital firms who'd invested in the company would receive detailed packets of evidence the morning of the wedding, giving them time to review the material and understand the scope of the fraud before any celebration could begin. And key guests including Brandon Cole and several of Marcus's business partners would receive anonymous emails containing highlights of the investigation, ensuring that even if Marcus tried to dismiss or downplay the situation, people would know the truth. My contribution would be more personal. I decided to send Marcus and Vanessa a wedding gift, something that would arrive a few days before the ceremony. Rachel helped me draft language that was legally careful but emotionally devastating. The gift would be a leather portfolio containing copies of all the financial evidence, the timeline of Marcus's fraud, and a letter explaining exactly how their relationship and upcoming wedding had been funded. The card would read simply, "Congratulations on building your future together. I thought you should know what it's built on." As June approached, I found myself oddly calm about what was coming. I'd spent 2 months working with Rachel's team, reviewing documents and providing information, watching the case against Marcus grow from my personal grievance into something much larger. The investigation had revealed other victims beyond me, investors who'd trusted Summit Digital with their money, employees who'd believed in the company's mission, even other women Marcus had apparently pursued before settling on Vanessa as his optimal upgrade. Brandon Cole reached out to me again in late May, this time asking if we could meet for coffee. He seemed troubled when we sat down at a cafe near his office in the Lloyd district. "I've been thinking about our conversation in April," he said. "About Marcus and the wedding and everything. Something's been bothering me and I don't know if I should say anything." I encouraged him to continue, curious what had prompted this meeting. Brandon hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Marcus asked me to help him with something weird. He wanted me to set up a separate bank account in my name, said it was for a surprise he was planning for Vanessa and didn't want her to accidentally see transactions. He transferred $30,000 to that account and asked me to pay for various wedding expenses from it." "Why would he do that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Brandon looked uncomfortable. "At first I thought he was just being romantic, hiding the costs of the wedding from Vanessa so she wouldn't stress about money. But then I started noticing the amounts didn't match what he told me things cost. He'd say the rehearsal dinner was $5,000 and asked me to pay that from the account. But when I looked up the actual venue, their pricing was less than half that. The extra money was going somewhere else." This was new information, another layer of financial manipulation I hadn't known about. "Did you ask him about the discrepancies?" I said. Brandon nodded. "He said I was overthinking it, that there were other expenses he was covering separately and just using my account for convenience. But Lauren, $30,000 has moved through that account in the past month. I don't know what he's spending it on, but it's not all wedding costs. And I'm starting to worry I'm being used to hide something." I made a decision in that moment. Brandon had been kind to me when he didn't have to be, warning me about Marcus's engagement plans when he could have stayed silent. He deserved to know he was right to be concerned. "I can't give you all the details yet," I told him, "but your instincts are correct. Marcus is hiding financial activity that he doesn't want scrutinized. My advice is to close that account immediately and document everything. You don't want to be implicated in what's coming." Brandon's face paled. "Is this about Summit Digital? The company?" I chose my words carefully. "It's about Marcus making decisions that benefit himself regardless of who gets hurt or what laws get broken. You've been his friend for years. You need to decide if loyalty to him is worth risking your own reputation and potentially your legal standing." We talked for another hour, Brandon gradually revealing concerns he'd had about Marcus's business practices and personal ethics for months. He'd dismissed his own doubts as jealousy or misunderstanding, wanting to believe his friend was the success story he appeared to be. But the accumulation of small irregularities, questionable decisions, and outright lies had been building into something he could no longer ignore. Before we parted, Brandon asked me directly, "Is something going to happen at the wedding? Should I not go?" "I can't tell you what to do," I said. "But if you value your reputation and your principles, you might want to be somewhere else on June 15th. What happens that day is going to change a lot of people's understanding of who Marcus Hamilton really is." Brandon canceled his role as best man the next day, citing a family emergency. Marcus was reportedly furious, scrambling to find a replacement and complaining to anyone who'd listen about disloyal friends. But I knew Brandon had made the right choice, protecting himself from the explosion that was now just days away. The wedding gift arrived at Marcus and Vanessa's Lake Oswego condo on June 12, 3 days before the ceremony. I'd had it beautifully wrapped, the leather portfolio enclosed in elegant paper with a silver ribbon. The card was tucked into a cream-colored envelope, my handwriting on the outside addressed to Marcus Hamilton and Vanessa Price. Everything about it looked like a thoughtful, expensive gift from someone who wished them well. I tried to imagine their reactions when they opened it. Would they look through the documents immediately or set them aside to review later? Would Vanessa understand the implications, or would Marcus have to explain how thoroughly their fraud had been documented? Would they panic, or would Marcus's arrogance convince him he could still talk his way out of consequences? Rachel called me that evening. "The gift was delivered and signed for by Vanessa," she reported. "And Agent Barnes confirmed that the SEC investigation is proceeding on schedule. The warrant will be executed on the 15th as planned. Are you holding up okay?" "I'm fine," I told her, and surprisingly it was true. I felt no anxiety or doubt, just a sense of inevitability. Marcus and Vanessa had created this situation through their choices. I was simply ensuring those choices had appropriate consequences. The morning of June 13th, my phone started buzzing with texts. Kara was the first to reach out, sending me screenshots of activity on Marcus's social media. He'd posted a story that was already deleted by the time I looked, but Kara had captured it. The image showed Marcus and Vanessa looking tense and angry, and the caption read, "When people try to ruin your happiness with lies and jealousy, but you know the truth of your love is stronger than any accusation." So they'd opened the gift and had chosen denial as their first response. Marcus was already spinning the narrative, framing the evidence as fabrications from someone jealous of their relationship. Several friends had commented supportive messages, telling Marcus and Vanessa to ignore the haters and focus on their special day. The delusion was almost impressive in its completeness. But the social media bravado didn't last. By that afternoon, Marcus had deleted all his posts and made his accounts private. Vanessa's Instagram went dark as well, the wedding countdown suddenly vanished. Something had shifted, some crack in their confidence opening up as they reviewed the documents more carefully or perhaps consulted with a lawyer who explained exactly how much trouble they were facing. Rachel texted me that evening with an update. Marcus's lawyer contacted Agent Barnes requesting a delay in the investigation. Barnes declined. The venture capital firms have all been briefed and are coordinating their response. Several have already moved to freeze Summit Digital's accounts pending a full audit. It's happening, Lauren. I spent the evening of June 14th alone in the apartment I'd finally rented for myself in the Selwood neighborhood. It was small, but it was mine, filled with furniture I'd chosen and books I'd collected, and none of the ghosts of a shared life with Marcus. I made myself dinner, poured a glass of wine, and thought about the girl who'd stood in that Pearl District loft bedroom 4 months ago, watching her world collapse around her. That version of me had been passive, accepting what Marcus and Vanessa told her about destiny and meant to be and things just happening. She believed that good people who worked hard and loved honestly would be rewarded with the lives they built together. She'd trusted that 4 years of partnership meant something, that promises made were promises kept. I wasn't that person anymore. I'd learned that sometimes the world didn't deliver justice automatically, that bad actors got away with their cruelty and fraud unless someone actively stopped them. I'd learned that being a good person didn't mean accepting mistreatment quietly. And I'd learned that I was capable of strategic action, of patience and planning and seeing a difficult thing through to its conclusion. The wedding was scheduled for 4 o'clock on June 15th at Timberline Lodge, with a reception following in the resort's main ballroom. I wouldn't be there to see Marcus and Vanessa's faces when Agent Barnes arrived with his warrant. I wouldn't witness the moment their carefully constructed celebration fell apart. But I'd arranged something almost better. Kevin Torres had connections with people who worked at the resort. For a reasonable fee, one of the audio-visual technicians had agreed to leave a laptop connected to the ballroom's projection system, programmed to begin displaying specific documents at precisely 5:30, right when toasts would normally begin. The documents would cycle through images of fraudulent financial statements, bank records showing misused investor funds, and that January receipt for the engagement ring purchased with my money. The final image would be a simple text screen reading, "This wedding was funded with stolen money. Ask Marcus Hamilton about Summit Digital's accounting practices. Ask Vanessa Price about her salary for work she never performed. Ask them both about the future they built on fraud and lies." The morning of June 15th arrived with the kind of perfect weather that wedding planners dream about. Clear blue skies stretched over Mount Hood, the early summer sun warming the alpine air around Timberline Lodge. I woke up in my Selwood apartment and made coffee, moving through my morning routine with unusual steadiness. Today was the day Marcus Hamilton and Vanessa Price would finally face the accumulated consequences of their choices, and I would be nowhere near the spectacle. Rachel had advised me to maintain complete distance from the events, establishing an alibi that placed me far from the wedding venue. I'd told Kara I was hiking in the Coast Range, turned off my phone's location services, and planned to spend the day at a quiet beach town where no one knew me or cared about Portland society weddings. The less connection I had to what was about to unfold, the better protected I'd be from any accusation of harassment or interference. But before I left the city, I met with Kevin Torres one final time at his office near Powell's Books. He had updates on several developments that had emerged in the past 48 hours, information that suggested Marcus and Vanessa's situation was even more precarious than we'd initially understood. The venture capital firms moved faster than we anticipated, Kevin explained, pulling up documents on his computer screen. Redwood Capital, the primary investor in Summit Digital, hired their own forensic accountant after receiving our evidence package. Their investigation uncovered additional irregularities we hadn't even documented yet. Apparently Marcus has been double billing clients, charging them for services Summit Digital never actually provided and pocketing the difference. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, leaning forward to see the numbers Kevin was highlighting. "Conservatively, another $150,000 in fraudulent billing over the past year. But here's where it gets interesting." Kevin clicked to another document. The clients he was overcharging? Several of them are owned by companies with federal contracts. Which means Marcus potentially defrauded government contractors, and that brings in a whole different level of federal scrutiny. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and shock. I'd known Marcus was willing to lie and steal to get what he wanted, but the scope of his fraud kept expanding beyond what I'd imagined. This wasn't just a man who'd had an affair and made some questionable financial decisions. This was systematic criminal behavior that had been ongoing for at least a year, probably longer. Kevin continued with more revelations. Vanessa's involvement is also deeper than we initially thought. She's been creating fake client accounts, generating false invoices, and helping Marcus move money through shell companies. Dr. Morrison found evidence that Vanessa was the one who actually set up the Cascade Holdings LLC, the company they're using to hide assets. She's not just a beneficiary of Marcus's fraud. She's an active participant and possibly the more sophisticated criminal of the two. The image I'd had of Vanessa as Marcus's mistress, the other woman who'd stolen my partner, was shifting into something more complex and darker. She wasn't just someone who'd fallen for a charismatic man and made bad choices in pursuit of love. She was a calculating criminal who'd seen an opportunity in Marcus and his growing company, positioned herself strategically, and helped him build an empire of fraud that enriched them both. "There's something else you should know," Kevin said, his expression growing more serious. "We found evidence that you weren't Marcus's first victim. Before you, he was in a long-term relationship with a woman named Christine Young. They were together for almost 6 years, lived together, even got engaged. Then Marcus suddenly broke it off, claiming he needed to focus on building his business." "What happened to her?" I asked quietly. Kevin pulled up an old news article. Christine filed a lawsuit against Marcus 3 years ago, claiming he'd stolen her graphic design work and used it to rebrand Summit Digital without credit or compensation. The case was settled out of court with a non-disclosure agreement, but I managed to track her down through some business contacts. She agreed to talk to me. He showed me notes from his interview with Christine. Her story was eerily similar to mine. A relationship that seemed solid and committed, Marcus's gradual emotional distance, his increasing obsession with business success, and finally a brutal ending where he walked away without remorse or accountability. Christine had contributed her professional skills to Summit Digital in its early days, creating the entire visual brand identity that Marcus later claimed as his company's work. When she demanded recognition and compensation, he'd threatened her with legal action and eventually paid her off to stay quiet. "She wanted you to know she believes you," Kevin said. "And she's willing to testify if any of this goes to trial." She said Marcus has a pattern of using people until they're no longer useful, then discarding them and rewriting history to erase their contributions. I sat back in my chair, processing this information. I'd thought my experience with Marcus was unique, a specific failure of our particular relationship. But the pattern Kevin was describing suggested something much more systematic. Marcus didn't just happen to be a person who made bad choices in moments of weakness. He was someone who deliberately exploited the people closest to him, taking what he needed and moving on when better opportunities appeared. Kevin had one more piece of information to share. "Agent Barnes executed the warrant this morning at 6 a.m., he said. Federal agents showed up at Marcus and Vanessa's condo in Lake Oswego and seized their computers, phones, and financial records. They're both officially under investigation for wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Barnes said Marcus tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that his jealous ex-girlfriend was making false accusations. But once they showed him the evidence from multiple independent sources, he stopped talking and asked for a lawyer. "So it's really happening," I said, the reality of it settling over me. "They're actually facing criminal charges." Kevin nodded. "The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they're definitely turning. And here's the thing, Lauren. Even if Marcus and Vanessa somehow avoid prison time, which is increasingly unlikely, their reputations are permanently destroyed. Summit Digital will collapse. Their business relationships are finished. Everyone in Portland's tech and startup community will know exactly what they did. The life they were building together, all that success and status they valued so much, it's gone." I left Kevin's office and drove west toward the coast, away from Portland and away from Timberline Lodge where Marcus and Vanessa's wedding was supposedly still scheduled to proceed in a few hours. I didn't know if they'd actually go through with the ceremony after federal agents had raided their home that morning. Maybe they'd canceled everything and were huddled with lawyers trying to minimize the damage. Or maybe Marcus's arrogance would convince them to pretend everything was fine, to maintain the facade for their guests and deal with the legal consequences later. Either way, the projection system Kevin had arranged would activate at 5:30. If there was a reception happening, their guests would see exactly what Marcus and Vanessa had been hiding. And even if they'd canceled the wedding, the evidence packets had already been sent to everyone who mattered in their professional and social circles. There was no scenario where they emerged from this day with their reputations intact. I spent the afternoon walking along Cannon Beach, watching tourists and families enjoy the sunshine. Children built sandcastles while their parents relaxed on blankets. Couples walked hand in hand along the waterline. Dogs chased seagulls with joyful abandon. It was a scene of uncomplicated happiness, people living their lives without the weight of betrayal and revenge and calculated destruction. Part of me envied them. The version of Lauren who'd existed 4 months ago would have fit into this scene perfectly. She believed in straightforward narratives where good people were rewarded and bad behavior had natural consequences. She'd trusted that doing the right thing and being a decent person was sufficient protection against cruelty. That Lauren would have been horrified by what I'd spent the past 2 months planning and executing. But I couldn't be that person anymore. Marcus and Vanessa had shown me that the world didn't work the way I'd believed. People lied without remorse, stole without guilt, and hurt others in pursuit of their own advancement. The only thing that stopped them was when someone decided to fight back, to refuse to be a silent victim, to make sure that consequences actually arrived. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. It was just after 5 p.m. The message was brief but loaded with meaning. Confirmed that the event is still happening. Technical elements are in place as planned. You should stay exactly where you are and keep your phone available in case authorities need to verify your location. So Marcus and Vanessa had decided to proceed with their wedding despite everything. The audacity was almost impressive. Federal agents had raided their home 12 hours ago, seizing evidence of their fraud. They'd received my gift containing documentation of their crimes. Multiple venture capital firms had frozen Summit Digital's accounts and were preparing legal action. And still they'd chosen to gather 200 guests at a luxury resort and pretend they were celebrating love and commitment rather than conspiracy and theft. I wondered what they'd told their guests. Had they acknowledged the morning's raid or simply avoided mentioning it, hoping no one would ask awkward questions? Had they spun some story about a misunderstanding that would be cleared up soon, maintaining the fiction that they were innocent victims of circumstance? Or had they said nothing at all, counting on social pressure to keep people from confronting them directly on what was supposed to be their special day? At 5:15, I found a bench overlooking the ocean and settled in to wait. I'd turned my phone's ringer off but kept it in my hand, refreshing my email every few minutes. Kevin had promised to send me a brief update once the projection system activated. I wouldn't get details or photos, nothing that could connect me directly to what happened, but he'd confirmed that the plan had executed as designed. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. 5:20. 5:25. I watched the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, the light turning golden across the water. Somewhere 90 miles inland, in a ballroom at Timberline Lodge, Marcus Hamilton and Vanessa Price were presumably sitting down to their reception dinner, surrounded by the people whose approval and admiration they craved above all else. At 5:32, my phone buzzed with an email from Kevin. The message contained just 3 words: package delivered successfully. I sat on that bench for another hour, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. My phone remained silent. No calls from frantic lawyers, no messages from mutual friends demanding to know if I was responsible, no contact from Marcus hurling accusations. Just silence and the sound of waves breaking on the shore. It wasn't until I was driving back to Portland around 8 p.m. that my phone started buzzing continuously. Texts from people I hadn't spoken to in months, even years. Friends of friends who'd heard something dramatic had happened at a wedding in the mountains. A few messages from former colleagues who'd worked with Marcus and wanted to know if the rumors about federal charges were true. I ignored all of them except one from Kara. She'd sent a link to a local news website with a breaking story. Federal authorities investigating Portland tech startup for fraud. Summit Digital CEO questioned in connection with misuse of investor funds. The article was light on details but confirmed that Marcus Hamilton was under investigation and that the inquiry had become public during what sources described as a wedding celebration at Timberline Lodge. The news story quoted an anonymous wedding guest describing chaos and confusion when authorities arrived during the reception. Financial documents had appeared on projection screens, the guest said, and then federal agents had entered the ballroom asking to speak with the groom. The ceremony had apparently concluded, meaning Marcus and Vanessa were legally married, but the reception had been cut short when several guests including major investors and business partners had walked out after seeing the projected evidence. Another text came through, this one from Brandon Cole. I don't know if you had anything to do with what happened today, but if you did, thank you. Marcus would have pulled me into his fraud if I hadn't cancelled. I owe you for the warning. I didn't reply immediately, keeping my distance from anything that could look like acknowledgement or involvement. But Brandon's message confirmed what I'd hoped. The people who deserved to know the truth now had it. Marcus's investors, his business partners, his friends and family, everyone who'd been celebrating his success and his romantic happiness, they all now understood what that success and happiness had been built on. Rachel called around 9 p.m. as I was pulling into my neighborhood. I answered on the car's Bluetooth. Please tell me you've been at the coast all day with witnesses who can confirm it, she said without preamble. I have been at the coast all day, I confirmed. I have receipts from a coffee shop and a restaurant. I took photos with timestamps. I'm covered. Good, because Marcus's lawyer has already started making noise about harassment and interference. He's claiming you orchestrated a campaign to destroy his client's reputation out of jealousy and spite. Agent Barnes shut that down pretty quickly by pointing out that the federal investigation was based on evidence from multiple sources, none of which originated with you. But you need to be prepared for Marcus to keep pushing that narrative. Let him, I said calmly. Everything that happened today was a direct result of his own criminal behavior. I didn't force him to commit fraud. I didn't make him steal investor money or overcharge clients or use company funds for personal expenses. I just made sure the right people knew what he'd done. Rachel was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, you did the right thing. Not the easy thing, but the right thing. Marcus and Vanessa were going to keep victimizing people until someone stopped them. A lot of individuals and companies are going to be spared future harm because you had the courage to act. After we hung up, I sat in my parked car outside my apartment building, letting the evening settle around me. Today had been building for 2 months, every piece carefully positioned, every consequence deliberately arranged. And now it was done. Marcus and Vanessa's wedding day had ended not with celebration but with exposure, their fraudulent empire beginning its collapse in front of everyone who mattered. But underneath the satisfaction, I felt something more complicated. This wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself 4 months ago. The Lauren who'd carried Thai food into her apartment expecting a normal evening had never planned to become someone who orchestrated elaborate revenge schemes. She'd wanted a simple life built on honesty and partnership, raising a family with someone she trusted, building a future together through shared effort and mutual respect. That future was gone, destroyed by Marcus's choices and my subsequent discoveries. In its place was this new reality where I'd learned to be strategic and calculating, where I'd spent weeks building a case designed to destroy someone else's life. The transformation felt both necessary and sad, a loss of innocence that couldn't be recovered even as justice was being served. Over the following days, more details emerged about what had happened at the wedding. Multiple news outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the dramatic intersection of romance and crime. Social media buzzed with speculation and gossip, people who'd never met Marcus or Vanessa offering opinions about their character and choices. The Portland tech community was particularly engaged, with founders and investors discussing what lessons could be learned about due diligence and trust. Summit Digital officially suspended operations on June 17. The venture capital firms that had invested in the company released a joint statement announcing they were pursuing all legal remedies to recover their funds. Several of Marcus's clients filed lawsuits claiming fraud and breach of contract. The Oregon Attorney General opened an investigation into consumer protection violations. Vanessa was fired from her nominal position as Director of Client Relations, though since she'd apparently never actually performed any work for the company, the firing was more symbolic than practical. Her real estate license was suspended pending an ethics review. The condo in Lake Oswego that she and Marcus had purchased with stolen funds was seized by federal authorities as proceeds of crime. Marcus himself released a statement through his lawyer denying all wrongdoing and claiming to be the victim of a coordinated smear campaign. The statement specifically mentioned a vindictive ex-partner who couldn't accept the end of their relationship and had fabricated evidence to destroy his happiness. Several news outlets reached out to me for comment, but I declined all interviews, maintaining complete public silence about my role in the investigation. Christine Young, Marcus's previous victim, went public with her story after seeing the news coverage. She gave an interview to a local technology podcast describing her experience with Marcus and how he'd stolen her work. Her account corroborated the pattern of exploitation and theft that the federal investigation was uncovering. Other former Summit Digital employees began coming forward with their own stories of inappropriate behavior, financial irregularities, and toxic workplace practices. The portrait that emerged was of a man who'd built his success through manipulation and fraud, who viewed other people as resources to be exploited rather than partners to be valued. And beside him was Vanessa, equally calculating and possibly more sophisticated in her criminal methods, someone who'd seen an opportunity in Marcus's ambition and helped him expand his fraudulent enterprise. On June 23, exactly 1 week after their disastrous wedding, Marcus and Vanessa were formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy. The indictment detailed a scheme that had defrauded investors of over $400,000 and clients of an additional $200,000. Both faced potential prison sentences of up to 20 years if convicted on all counts. I learned about the charges from the same news websites everyone else used. I was no longer part of the investigation, having provided my evidence and testimony weeks earlier. My role was finished. The justice system would proceed from here, grinding through its slow but methodical process of prosecution and trial and eventual sentencing. Rachel sent me a bottle of good wine with a note that read, "You can be proud of what you accomplished. Not many people have the strength to stand up for themselves the way you did." We met for dinner to celebrate, though celebration felt like too strong a word for what I was experiencing. Relief, maybe. Closure, possibly. But also a profound weariness that came from carrying the weight of calculated revenge for so long. "Do you regret any of it?" Rachel asked over our meal at a restaurant in the Pearl District, not far from the loft Marcus and I had shared. I considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that Marcus made choices that hurt so many people and forced me to become someone who plans this kind of intervention. But do I regret actually doing it? No. He needed to be stopped, and no one else was going to do it. "What happens to you now?" Rachel asked. "How does Lauren Bradley move forward from all this?" It was a good question, one I'd been asking myself frequently. The past 2 months had consumed my energy and focus, giving me a purpose even as it required me to embrace darker parts of my personality. With that purpose fulfilled, I needed to figure out who I was beyond Marcus's ex-girlfriend and the person who'd brought down his fraudulent empire. The summer unfolded with a strange sense of suspended reality. While Marcus and Vanessa's legal troubles dominated Portland's tech community gossip and made regular appearances in local business news, I focused on rebuilding the life I'd put on hold during my months of investigation. I took on more freelance writing projects, reconnected with friends I'd neglected, and slowly transformed my small Selwood apartment into a space that felt genuinely mine rather than just a temporary refuge. But the past had a way of refusing to stay buried. In early July, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Helen Morrison, the forensic accountant who'd helped build the case against Summit Digital. She asked if we could meet for coffee, saying she'd uncovered something during her continued analysis of the company's records that I needed to know about. We met at a quiet cafe in the Hawthorne district on a warm afternoon. Dr. Morrison arrived with her ever-present leather briefcase, pulling out a slim folder before she'd even ordered her drink. Her expression was troubled in a way I hadn't seen during our previous interactions when she'd been energized by the puzzle of unraveling financial fraud. "I've been working with the federal prosecutors to prepare evidence for trial," she explained. "Part of that process involves tracing every fraudulent transaction back to its source, establishing exactly when the criminal behavior began and who was responsible for what actions. And I found something that changes the timeline we initially established." She opened the folder to reveal bank statements and transaction records marked with colored highlighter. "These are transfers from Summit Digital's accounts to various personal accounts belonging to Marcus," she said, pointing to specific lines. "We knew about most of these already. But look at the dates on these particular transfers." I leaned forward, studying the statements. The highlighted transactions dated back almost 5 years, long before Marcus had received venture capital funding, back when Summit Digital was still a startup operating out of a shared office space. "What am I looking at?" I asked. Dr. Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. "These are transfers that Marcus made to himself from the company account during the first year of Summit Digital's operation. Small amounts initially, 500 here, 1,000 there. But they establish a pattern of treating company funds as his personal money from the very beginning. And Lauren, these dates overlap significantly with your relationship." I felt a cold weight settling in my stomach. "We started dating in the spring 5 years ago. Marcus launched Summit Digital that summer." "Exactly," Dr. Morrison said. "Which means the financial impropriety we documented wasn't a recent development that emerged after Marcus got successful and arrogant. It was present from the start. He was stealing from his own company while you two were building what you thought was a partnership based on honesty and shared sacrifice." She pulled out another document, this one showing a timeline she'd constructed. "Remember how you told us you'd taken on extra freelance work during Summit Digital's early days because money was tight? That you'd contributed more than your share to household expenses so Marcus could invest everything in the business?" I nodded, remembering those lean months when I'd worked 60-hour weeks to cover our rent and groceries while Marcus poured every dollar into his startup dream. I'd been proud of my contribution, believing we were partners building something together. During that exact same period, Dr. Morrison continued, Marcus was transferring money from Summit Digital into a separate personal account. Not large amounts by later standards, but enough that he was never actually as financially struggling as he led you to believe. You were sacrificing to support his business while he was secretly maintaining a cushion for himself. The revelation shouldn't have hurt after everything else I'd learned about Marcus. But somehow this felt worse than the affair or even the major fraud. Those had been betrayals of trust within an established relationship. This was evidence that the foundation itself had been corrupt from the beginning, that Marcus had been deceiving me about basic financial realities from almost the moment we'd started dating. "There's more," Dr. Morrison said quietly. "The seed funding Marcus claimed came from personal savings and a small business loan. The bank records show that a significant portion actually came from a private investor we haven't been able to fully identify yet. Someone gave Marcus $50,000 in cash during the company's first year, and he never disclosed it in any official documentation." "Why does that matter?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Because undisclosed investors are a major red flag for financial crimes," Dr. Morrison explained. "It suggests either money laundering or that Marcus was taking investment without proper legal structure, which creates securities violations. And the timing is significant. This mysterious $50,000 arrived right after Summit Digital's first major client contract, the one Marcus always described as his breakthrough moment that validated the business model. I remembered that contract. Marcus had come home ecstatic, opening a bottle of champagne we couldn't really afford to celebrate. He'd told me this was the beginning of everything we'd worked for, that success was finally within reach. I'd believed him completely, never questioning the narrative he presented. "The federal prosecutors want to identify this mystery investor," Dr. Morrison said. "They're concerned it might connect to other criminal activity or reveal additional fraud we haven't uncovered yet. Which brings me to why I wanted to talk to you. Do you remember Marcus mentioning anyone who might have provided early funding? Any names that came up during that first year of the business?" I thought back, trying to recall conversations from 5 years ago. Marcus had been secretive about his business dealings even then, claiming he didn't want to bore me with the details of contracts and financing. I'd interpreted it as him protecting our personal time from work stress, never considering it might be deliberate obscuration. "There was someone," I said slowly, a memory surfacing. "Marcus had a meeting one night at a bar downtown, someplace near Pioneer Square. He was nervous about it, which was unusual for him. When he came home, he was excited but also kind of evasive about who he'd met with. He just said it was a potential investor who believed in Summit Digital's vision." "Do you remember anything specific?" Dr. Morrison pressed. "The bar name, approximate date, anything Marcus said about this person?" I closed my eyes, trying to pull details from years past. It was late fall, maybe October or November of that first year. The bar was one of those upscale places. I remember Marcus wore a suit, which he almost never did back then. He came home with this leather portfolio, really expensive looking. Said the investor had given it to him as a symbol of their partnership. Dr. Morrison was taking rapid notes. "Do you still have that portfolio? Could you describe it?" The question jolted another memory loose. I'd seen that portfolio recently. Marcus had left it behind in one of the boxes I'd packed when moving out of the Pearl District loft. It had been mixed in with old files and business documents, and I'd almost thrown it away before deciding to keep it just in case it was needed for the investigation. "I have it," I told Dr. Morrison. "It's in my storage unit with other things from the apartment. I can get it this afternoon if you think it's important." Her expression suggested it was very important indeed. Anything connected to that mystery investor could be crucial evidence. The prosecutors are building a case that Marcus's fraudulent behavior wasn't opportunistic but systematic and deliberate from the beginning. Physical evidence of undisclosed investors would support that theory significantly. We drove together to the storage facility where I'd been keeping boxes of my old life in climate-controlled limbo. Sorting through the containers felt archaeological, unearthing artifacts from a relationship I'd thought I understood but clearly hadn't. The leather portfolio was in a box marked Marcus Business Stuff, nestled among old contracts and marketing materials from Summit Digital's early days. The portfolio itself was distinctive, expensive Italian leather with brass hardware and Marcus's initials embossed on the front. Dr. Morrison examined it carefully, photographing every angle before opening it. Inside were business cards, old notes in Marcus's handwriting, and tucked into a small pocket, a creased cocktail napkin with a phone number and a name written in different handwriting. Victor Reyes, Dr. Morrison read aloud. Does that name mean anything to you? I shook my head, but something about the name felt vaguely familiar. Dr. Morrison was already on her phone, pulling up search results. Her expression shifted as she read. Victor Reyes is a venture capitalist with a history of backing high-risk startups in the Pacific Northwest. He's also been investigated twice by the SEC for securities violations, though charges were never filed. If he was Marcus's mystery investor, it explains a lot about how Summit Digital operated from the beginning. She carefully photographed the napkin and everything else in the portfolio, then called Agent Barnes to report what we'd found. I listened to her half of the conversation, hearing terms like pattern of deception and criminal enterprise and RICO predicates. The investigation I'd helped initiate was expanding far beyond what I'd imagined, uncovering layers of fraud and misconduct that reached back to the foundation of Marcus's business. After Dr. Morrison left with the portfolio secured as evidence, I sat in my car outside the storage facility trying to process what I'd learned. Every memory I had of those early years with Marcus was being rewritten by new information. The struggling entrepreneur I'd supported hadn't been struggling at all. The ethical businessman I'd believed in had been corrupt from the start. Even our most intimate moments of discussing dreams and building plans together had been happening while Marcus was actively deceiving me about basic facts. That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding for months. I pulled out the journals I'd kept during my relationship with Marcus, notebooks where I'd recorded thoughts and feelings and significant moments. Reading through them was painful, seeing my younger self's trust and optimism, her belief that working hard and loving honestly was enough to build a secure future. But reading with the knowledge I now had revealed patterns I'd been too close to see before. The times Marcus had been vague about money. The moments when he'd discouraged me from getting too involved in Summit Digital's business side. The way he'd always maintained separate financial accounts even as we shared household expenses, claiming it was simpler for tax purposes. All the small ways he'd maintained control of information and kept me from seeing the full picture of what he was really doing. There was one entry from 3 years ago that particularly struck me. I'd written about a dinner party we'd hosted for some of Marcus's business contacts. One of the guests had asked me about Summit Digital's growth trajectory, and I'd admitted I didn't know many details because Marcus handled the business side of things. The guest had looked surprised and said something about how most startup founders' partners were deeply involved in the early years, serving as unpaid advisors and sounding boards. Marcus had laughed it off, saying he wanted to protect me from the stress of business uncertainties. But I'd noted in my journal feeling slightly embarrassed by my own ignorance about what my partner did all day. That embarrassment had been valid. Marcus had deliberately kept me uninformed, maintaining a separation between his business and personal life that served his need for secrecy rather than my need for protection. And I'd accepted it because questioning him would have felt like distrust, like violating the terms of our relationship. My phone rang around 8 p.m., pulling me out of my retrospective spiral. It was Rachel, calling with news that the federal prosecutors wanted to meet with me again. They'd learned about the Victor Reyes connection and had additional questions about Marcus's business practices during our relationship. They're building a much larger case now, Rachel explained. It's not just about the specific fraud against recent investors. They're looking at Summit Digital as a criminal enterprise that's been operating with fraudulent intent from inception. Your testimony about Marcus's financial behavior during those early years could be crucial to establishing that pattern. I agreed to meet with the prosecutors, spending several hours the following week in a federal building downtown answering detailed questions about money and business decisions from years ago. The assistant U.S. attorney leading the case was a sharp woman named Jennifer Kozak who had the kind of focused intensity that suggested she took white-collar crime very personally. Marcus Hamilton presents himself as a successful entrepreneur who made some bad decisions, she explained during our meeting. But what we're uncovering suggests someone who never intended to operate honestly, who built an entire company on fraudulent practices and used personal relationships as cover for financial crimes. Your testimony helps establish that this wasn't a good man who went bad. This was someone who was deceptive and manipulative from the very beginning. The trial was scheduled for late September, giving the prosecutors 3 months to build their case. In the meantime, more information kept emerging as investigators dug deeper into Summit Digital's operations. The company had apparently been operating as a kind of Ponzi scheme, using money from new investors to pay returns to earlier investors while Marcus and Vanessa siphoned off funds for personal use. Victor Reyes was brought in for questioning and immediately hired one of the most expensive defense attorneys in Portland. His involvement with Summit Digital was more extensive than the initial $50,000 investment. He'd apparently provided ongoing financial backing and advice, helping Marcus structure the company in ways that made the fraud harder to detect. Reyes was now facing charges of his own for conspiracy and aiding and abetting securities fraud. In August, I received an unexpected letter forwarded from my old address at the Pearl District loft. The return address was the Lake Oswego jail where Vanessa was being held after violating her bail conditions by attempting to transfer assets to an offshore account. The letter was handwritten on lined paper, Vanessa's perfect cursive filling 3 pages. The letter began with an apology of sorts, though it was hedged with justifications and explanations. Vanessa claimed she'd never intended for things to go as far as they did, that she'd genuinely fallen in love with Marcus and only later discovered the extent of his fraudulent activities. She portrayed herself as another victim, someone who'd been manipulated by Marcus's charisma and lies. But then the letter took a darker turn. Vanessa wrote about how Marcus had told her about me during their early affair, painting me as controlling and demanding, someone who'd been holding him back from his full potential. She claimed Marcus had said I was obsessed with marriage and children, that I'd given him an ultimatum that had pushed him away. The narrative was so contrary to reality that it would have been laughable if it hadn't been so disturbing. The letter concluded with something that felt more honest. Vanessa wrote that she understood now what Marcus was, that his pattern of deception wasn't limited to business or to me. He'd been lying to her too, maintaining other affairs she'd only learned about during the investigation, hiding assets even from her, treating her the way he'd treated every other person in his life as a resource to be exploited until no longer useful. I know you probably hate me, Vanessa wrote, and you have every right to. But I wanted you to know that Marcus didn't win. He didn't ride off into the sunset with me and live happily ever after. He destroyed both our lives, and now he's finally facing consequences. Maybe that's not enough for what he did to you, but it's something. I didn't respond to the letter, though I showed it to Rachel, who made copies for her files. Vanessa's attempt at building some kind of solidarity between us felt hollow given that she'd been an active participant in fraud that hurt many people beyond just me. But there was something in her words that resonated anyway. Marcus hadn't won. The future he'd been building on lies and theft had collapsed completely, and everyone could see him now for what he'd always been. As September approached and the trial date drew closer, I found myself thinking less about Marcus and more about the person I'd become through this process. The months of investigation and evidence gathering and strategic planning had changed me in ways I was still discovering. I was harder now, less willing to accept people's presentations of themselves at face value, more attuned to inconsistencies and warning signs. But I was also stronger. I'd faced a devastating betrayal and chosen action over passive acceptance. I'd learned I was capable of sustained strategic thinking, of managing complex information and coordinating with professionals to achieve a difficult goal. The version of myself who'd stood frozen in that Pearl District bedroom holding a stained shirt seemed like a different person entirely, someone younger and more naive who I'd left behind in the process of seeking justice. Dr. Morrison called a week before the trial was scheduled to begin. The prosecutors had offered Marcus and Vanessa a plea deal. Reduced charges in exchange for guilty pleas and cooperation in the case against Victor Reyes. Marcus was considering it, his lawyers apparently convinced that going to trial would result in even harsher sentences given the strength of the evidence. "How do you feel about that?" Dr. Morrison asked. "A plea deal means no trial, which might feel anticlimactic after everything you've been through." I thought about it for a moment before answering. I don't need a dramatic courtroom confrontation. I needed Marcus to face real consequences for his actions, to have his fraud exposed publicly, and to lose the life he built on lies. All of that has already happened. Whether he admits his guilt in a plea deal or gets convicted at trial doesn't change the fundamental outcome. That's a healthy perspective, Dr. Morrison said. Some victims get very attached to the idea of a trial as vindication. But the truth is, a guilty plea serves the same purpose legally and spares everyone the trauma of extended proceedings. Marcus accepted the plea deal 3 days before trial was scheduled to begin. He pleaded guilty to wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy charges, agreeing to a recommended sentence of 12 years in federal prison and full restitution to his victims. Vanessa accepted a similar deal with a recommended sentence of 8 years given her slightly lesser role in initiating the fraud. The sentencing hearing took place on a gray October morning in the federal courthouse downtown. I sat in the gallery with Rachel beside me, watching Marcus and Vanessa stand before Judge Patricia Thornton to learn their fate. Marcus looked smaller somehow, diminished in his orange jumpsuit without the expensive suits and confident bearing that had defined him. Vanessa kept her eyes down, hands clasped in front of her. Judge Thornton was thorough in her remarks before imposing sentence. She spoke about the betrayal of trust that fraud represented, the harm done not just to investors and clients but to every person who'd believed in Marcus and Vanessa's honesty. She noted the systematic nature of their crimes, the years of deliberate deception, and the complete lack of remorse they'd shown until facing prosecution. Marcus Hamilton, you constructed an empire of lies, Judge Thornton said. You exploited people who loved you, deceived people who trusted you, and stole from people who believed in your vision. The harm you've caused extends far beyond financial losses. You've damaged faith in entrepreneurship, in relationships, in the basic assumption that people operate with integrity. She sentenced Marcus to 14 years in federal prison, 2 years more than the plea agreement had recommended. Vanessa received 10 years. Both would be required to pay full restitution to their victims, amounts that would likely take decades to satisfy given that most of the stolen money had been spent on their lifestyle rather than invested anywhere recoverable. I felt no triumph watching them taken into custody. What I felt was something quieter and more complex, a sense of completion mixed with lingering sadness for the years I'd lost believing in someone who'd never been real. The man I'd loved hadn't existed except as a performance Marcus gave when it suited his purposes. And the life I'd thought we were building together had been a fiction all along. Outside the courthouse, several reporters tried to ask me questions. I declined all interviews, walking past them with Rachel running interference. My story wasn't for public consumption. What had happened between Marcus and me was personal, even as its consequences had played out in federal court. Christine Young was waiting near my car, the woman whose relationship with Marcus had preceded mine. We'd exchanged emails during the investigation but never met in person. She was petite with sharp eyes that assessed me carefully as I approached. I wanted to thank you, she said without preamble. For having the courage to do what I couldn't 5 years ago. Marcus paid me off and I took it because I was tired of fighting. But you didn't let him get away with it. You made sure he actually faced consequences. We talked for nearly an hour in that parking garage, two women who'd loved the same man at different times, comparing notes on how he manipulated and exploited us. The similarities were eerie, from the way he'd isolated us from his business dealings to how he'd turned cold when ending the relationships to his complete lack of accountability for his actions. Do you think he ever actually cared about any of us? Christine asked as we were parting. Or were we always just tools he used? I'd thought about that question many times over the past months. I think Marcus cares about Marcus, I said finally. And he's capable of valuing people for what they provide him. But genuine concern for another person's well-being independent of his own benefit? I don't think that's something he's capable of feeling. The months following the sentencing brought a strange kind of peace. With Marcus in prison and the legal proceedings concluded, I could finally stop looking backward and start focusing on what came next. I took on a long-term project writing for a Portland tech publication, ironically covering the startup scene that Marcus had been part of. My editor knew my history and gave me latitude to write about ethics in entrepreneurship and the warning signs of fraudulent business practices. Brandon Cole reached out in November asking if we could meet for coffee. He'd left the tech industry entirely, he told me, taking a job teaching business ethics at Portland State University. The experience with Marcus had changed his perspective on success and ambition and what actually mattered in building a meaningful career. I spent years watching Marcus prioritize growth over integrity, Brandon said. I told myself it was just how business worked at that level, that corners had to be cut to compete. But the truth is I knew it was wrong. I knew he was lying and cheating and hurting people. I just didn't want to lose access to his success by calling him out. We all made choices, I said. The important thing is learning from them and doing better going forward. As the year drew to a close, I found myself taking stock of what the past 9 months had taught me. I'd learned that betrayal could be survived, that strength could be found in unexpected places, and that justice sometimes required active pursuit rather than passive faith that the universe would balance itself. I'd discovered I was capable of strategic thinking and sustained determination when protecting myself and others from harm. But I'd also learned the cost of revenge, the way it changed you even when justified. The Lauren who'd walked into that Pearl District loft in March was gone, replaced by someone harder and more guarded. I'd gained strength but lost a certain innocence, a belief in straightforward goodness that couldn't be recovered. On New Year's Eve, I stood on my apartment balcony watching fireworks bloom over the city. Somewhere across town, Kara was hosting a party I'd chosen not to attend, preferring quiet reflection to celebration. The past year had been defined by Marcus and his crimes and the campaign to hold him accountable. The new year would be about building something entirely my own. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Happy New Year to the strongest person I know. You survived betrayal and chose justice over bitterness. That takes remarkable character. I typed back a simple thank you, then set the phone aside and watched the last of the fireworks fade into smoke. Marcus Hamilton had taken 4 years of my life and taught me painful lessons about trust and deception. But he hadn't broken me. He'd revealed strength I hadn't known I possessed and clarified values I'd only vaguely understood before. The gift I'd sent to his wedding had ruined his carefully constructed future. But in doing so, it had freed me to build something authentic in its place. Not the fairy tale romance I'd once believed in, but something more real and more resilient. A life built on truth rather than lies, on genuine self-knowledge rather than comfortable illusions. That seemed like justice enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.